Ladies and gentlemen, in the shadows of post-war France, while the nation rebuilt itself into a modern republic, a storm was brewing in the city of Lyon. It wasn't political, nor was it revolutionary. It was criminal, cold, calculated, and utterly fearless. This storm had a name: the Lyonnais Gang. During the 1950s and 60s, Lyon began to develop a reputation as a city where the lines between legality and crime often blurred. Amidst the rise of black markets, smuggling routes, and petty theft rings, a new breed of criminal began to emerge, one that was organized, tactical, and unafraid to use violence as a means to an end. It was in this environment that a group of young men, some of whom had roots in petty crime while others had military or resistance backgrounds, began forming the foundation of what would become the Lyonnais Gang. Unlike traditional street gangs that relied on brute force and chaotic robberies, this group was different. They were ambitious, calculating, and determined to rise above the average criminal. The leaders were visionaries in their own dark way. They didn't want to be seen as thugs, but as professionals. They studied the weaknesses in bank security systems, learned police response times, and even built relationships within the underworld to access weapons, safe houses, and stolen vehicles. The gang's formation wasn't an overnight phenomenon. It evolved over time, with key figures like Edmond Vidal, also known as Maman, rising in prominence. Vidal, of Romani descent, was known not just for his toughness but for his discipline, loyalty, and strategic thinking, traits that would eventually shape the ethos of the gang. Under his influence, the group began to grow in confidence and ambition, targeting bigger and more secure establishments. By the late 1960s, the Lyonnais Gang had shifted from being a loose network of criminals to a well-organized syndicate with a clear hierarchy and a shared purpose. They weren't just reacting to opportunity. They were creating it, engineering heists that would soon shake the foundations of law enforcement and redefine organized crime in France. What truly set the Lyonnais Gang apart from other criminal groups of their time was not just their boldness, but the astonishing precision with which they executed their crimes. Their robberies weren't spontaneous or reckless. They were cold, calculated operations that bore the fingerprints of military planning. Every move was rehearsed, every second accounted for, and every escape route mapped in advance. These men didn't see themselves as petty thieves. They operated like a tactical unit. Before a heist, the gang would spend weeks, sometimes months, conducting surveillance on their target. They studied employee routines, police patrol schedules, alarm systems, and even the timing of armored truck deliveries. The gang often recorded footage, monitored traffic patterns, and used informants to obtain blueprints or internal security codes. No detail was too small, no step taken without analysis. On the day of an operation, the execution was swift and almost surgical. Gang members were assigned specific roles: entry team, lookout, getaway driver, and crowd control. Communication was constant, often via radio equipment stolen from law enforcement sources. They wore matching outfits, sometimes disguises like police or security guards, and used silenced weapons to minimize attention. Their presence in the targeted location was typically under 5 minutes, yet the scale of the robbery could involve millions of francs. The gang moved in formation, covered each other's blind spots, and coordinated like a squad of trained soldiers. This wasn't a coincidence. Several members of the gang had military experience or had been shaped by France's wartime history, learning discipline and tactics from either the French army or the resistance. These skills translated into a new kind of criminal, one who could challenge the state's law enforcement and get away clean. They also had strict internal protocols. No one spoke out of turn during operations. Panic was punished, and emotional outbursts were seen as liabilities. Orders were followed to the letter. If something went wrong, contingency plans were in place. Backup routes, alternate vehicles, and hideouts prepared days in advance. Unlike other gangs, they didn't rely on luck. They relied on planning, teamwork, and nerves of steel. The French police, trained mostly to deal with traditional street crime and disorganized robbers, were completely outmatched. They had never seen anything like the Lyonnais Gang. Each robbery humiliated law enforcement further, exposing deep flaws in security systems and forcing a nationwide reassessment of how prepared France was to deal with modern organized crime. The Lyonnais Gang quickly earned a notorious reputation across France for their audacious, high-stakes robberies that targeted some of the country's most secure institutions. They didn't waste time with petty theft or small-time jobs. They aimed directly at the heart of the financial system. Armored trucks, central bank branches, and payroll offices carrying vast sums of money. Their operations were fast, violent when necessary, and always meticulously planned. One of their most infamous tactics was attacking armored security vans, the vehicles responsible for transporting large amounts of cash and valuables between banks and businesses. These vans were heavily protected, both by reinforced armor and armed guards. But to the Lyonnais Gang, they were just another challenge to overcome. Often, the gang would intercept the vehicle in transit, using stolen or modified cars to create roadblocks, forcing the van to stop in isolated areas. Within moments, masked men would surround the van, neutralize the guards, and load the cash into their getaway vehicles. Some of these heists lasted less than 3 minutes, but resulted in the theft of millions of francs. Their bank jobs were equally legendary. In one particularly daring robbery, the gang infiltrated a regional bank branch during closing hours, having already bribed or threatened key insiders. They disabled alarm systems, forced open vaults using industrial-grade tools, and left behind almost no trace. Even the most modern security systems of the time proved no match for their preparation. In some cases, they used explosives to blow open safes or doors, a technique that left a trail of destruction and fear, but also demonstrated just how far they were willing to go to achieve their goals. The gang's choice of targets wasn't random. They studied financial patterns, sometimes striking on payday weekends, when cash flow in banks and armored trucks was at its highest. In one heist, they reportedly stole the equivalent of over 10 million francs in today's money, and vanished without a single suspect or lead for weeks. What made these robberies even more terrifying was their boldness in daylight. The Lyonnais Gang didn't always strike under cover of darkness. Some of their most successful jobs occurred during business hours, surrounded by witnesses. The gang moved so quickly and with such authority that many onlookers initially mistook them for legitimate law enforcement personnel responding to an emergency. Their heists weren't just about money. They were a display of control. Each robbery chipped away at public confidence in the police and revealed how vulnerable even the most secure financial systems were when faced with a disciplined, militarized gang. At the center of the Lyonnais Gang's rise to infamy stood one man, Edmond Vidal, known by the nickname Maman. Charismatic, intelligent, and ruthlessly disciplined, Vidal was more than just a leader. He was the architect of the gang's philosophy, operations, and structure. His influence transformed a loose network of street-level criminals into one of the most feared organized crime syndicates in France's modern history. Born into a Romani family, Vidal grew up in poverty on the fringes of society, where discrimination, hardship, and survival were part of daily life. He was no stranger to marginalization, and from a young age, he developed a tough exterior and a sharp mind. While many viewed the world through the lens of fear and scarcity, Vidal saw opportunity. He understood how power worked, how people could be manipulated, how systems could be studied and exploited, and most of all, how loyalty could be weaponized. What made Vidal so effective wasn't just his street smarts. It was his ability to command respect. He had a presence that inspired both fear and admiration. Those who followed him did so with absolute loyalty, not just because of the wealth he promised, but because of the structure and discipline he demanded. Unlike many gang leaders who ruled through intimidation alone, Vidal built a culture of brotherhood, strategic thinking, and shared responsibility. Every member of the gang had a role, and no one, including Vidal, was above the code they operated under. His leadership style was almost military in nature. Vidal ran the gang with precision, holding debriefs before and after each job, assigning tasks based on skill, and insisting on rehearsals to minimize risk. Mistakes were not tolerated. If someone failed to follow orders or drew unnecessary attention, they were either expelled from the inner circle or dealt with more harshly. For Vidal, the gang's reputation, security, and success came before personal relationships or emotions. Despite his criminal activities, Vidal maintained an image of a family man and community figure. To outsiders, he appeared calm, composed, and even generous. He lived a double life with uncanny ease, one foot in the violent underworld, the other in the everyday life of a Lyon resident. This dual identity made him even more difficult to track. Police surveillance often found nothing more than a man having coffee in a public square or playing cards with neighbors. Never the criminal mastermind pulling strings behind multi-million-franc robberies. Under Vidal's leadership, the Lyonnais Gang didn't just operate, they thrived. His ability to plan long-term, read people, and maintain internal unity gave the gang a significant advantage over both rival criminals and law enforcement. Even when the police suspected him, they struggled to make charges stick. He was careful, cautious, and always 3 steps ahead. One of the most striking aspects of the Lyonnais Gang's criminal operations was their advanced use of disguises and technology, tools that, at the time, were largely unheard of in the world of French organized crime. These weren't amateur robbers in ski masks. They were professionals who understood that brute force could only get them so far. To remain elusive, effective, and unpredictable, they needed deception, innovation, and a deep understanding of their enemy, the police. The gang frequently used police and security uniforms to gain access to restricted areas or to avoid suspicion during their heists. In several robberies, they were seen calmly entering buildings dressed as law enforcement officers, their confidence and appearance so convincing that witnesses did not question their presence. This tactic allowed them to bypass early resistance, get closer to their targets undetected, and create confusion once the robbery was underway. They also used fake identification documents, counterfeit vehicle plates, and modified getaway cars that looked ordinary but were carefully engineered for speed and durability. These vehicles were often stolen well in advance, repainted, and stashed in locations that were carefully chosen for both entry and exit routes. During the robbery, secondary vehicles were sometimes parked in hidden spots to facilitate escape if the primary route was compromised. But perhaps even more impressive was their use of communication technology, particularly their access to police radio frequencies. The Lyonnais Gang was known to intercept radio chatter using modified walkie-talkies or scanners, allowing them to monitor police response in real time. This gave them a crucial advantage. If law enforcement units were dispatched to the scene, the gang could alter their plan mid-operation, take alternate routes, or delay engagement until it was safe. It turned the cat-and-mouse game heavily in their favor. Inside the planning phase, they often used blueprints, alarm schematics, and surveillance routines gathered through insiders or through weeks of their own reconnaissance. Vidal and his lieutenants would take the time to understand exactly how a target functioned, when the security systems were armed, how long response teams typically took to arrive, and what vulnerabilities existed in physical infrastructure. In one case, they used a construction crew disguise to gain access to the inside of a bank a full day before the heist, posing as repairmen while secretly preparing the location for the robbery. Even their attire during the crimes was strategic. In some jobs, they wore matching overalls, gloves, and masks not just to hide identities, but to leave no forensic trace, no fingerprints, no fibers, no DNA. Their careful attention to forensics was far ahead of its time, especially considering that forensic science in the 1970s was still in its relative infancy in Europe. The gang operated as if they were already anticipating how crime scene investigations would evolve. The Lyonnais Gang understood a fundamental truth: information is power. And they used that information, whether through stolen tech, fake identities, or insider knowledge, to stay several steps ahead of the law. Their strategic use of disguise and technology didn't just make their heists successful. It made them nearly invisible, ghost-like figures in a city that was always a few seconds too late to catch them. One of the defining characteristics that allowed the Lyonnais Gang to operate with such impunity for years was their unwavering code of silence, known in French criminal circles as le silence d'or, the golden silence. This unspoken rule was more than just an agreement to keep quiet. It was a binding oath, a fundamental pillar that held the entire organization together, and a tool that made the gang nearly impenetrable by law enforcement. The Lyonnais Gang understood better than most that talk is cheap, but betrayal could be deadly. From the moment a recruit was accepted into the inner circle, they were indoctrinated with this code, emphasizing loyalty above all else. Sharing details of a job, naming fellow members, or cooperating with police investigations was considered the ultimate betrayal, not just of the gang, but of one's own honor and survival. This loyalty was enforced through a combination of respect, fear, and consequences. Members who even hinted at disloyalty risked severe punishment, including violence or permanent expulsion from the group. The gang was careful to surround itself with trusted associates, often individuals from close-knit communities or families, where loyalty was ingrained culturally. For many, it was not just about personal allegiance to the gang, but about protecting their entire social circle. The Code of Silence also created a powerful psychological barrier against law enforcement. Even when arrested, many gang members remained tight-lipped, refusing to cooperate despite facing lengthy prison sentences or harsh interrogations. This silence frustrated investigators, who often had limited evidence beyond eyewitness accounts and circumstantial proof. Without inside testimony, prosecuting the gang was an uphill battle. In addition to keeping secrets, the code extended to how information was handled during operations. Members were trained to share only what was necessary for a particular task. Communication followed a strict need-to-know basis. No one was fully aware of every detail of a heist, reducing the risk of accidental leaks or betrayals. This culture of secrecy also served as a form of protection against rival gangs and informants. By limiting information flow, the Lyonnais Gang minimized the risk that external enemies could sabotage their plans or that law enforcement could plant undercover agents within their ranks. The Code of Silence was not simply about hiding crimes. It was about building trust and creating a family-like bond among members who faced danger together. It transformed the gang from a mere criminal group into a brotherhood, where every man knew that the others would have his back no matter the cost. This loyalty made infiltration almost impossible for years, as police were forced to rely on painstaking surveillance, technological breakthroughs, and occasional betrayals from outside sources rather than inside cooperation. The gang's secretive nature, combined with their discipline and tactical expertise, established a nearly impenetrable fortress of silence around their criminal empire. The Lyonnais Gang's dominance over the French criminal underworld in the 1970s did not come without intense competition and violent conflicts. As their reputation and wealth grew, so did tensions with other criminal factions vying for control over lucrative territories, rackets, and heist opportunities. These fierce rivalries were marked by brutal confrontations that often spilled into the streets, creating an atmosphere of fear and chaos that gripped not only Lyon but several other regions across France. At the time, France's criminal landscape was fragmented, with various gangs operating in different cities and regions, each with its own specialties and alliances. The Lyonnais Gang's strategic success and military precision made them a direct threat to long-established groups who controlled smuggling routes, protection rackets, and black markets. Competition over these resources often turned deadly, with turf wars breaking out over control of territory that promised access to wealth and power. One of the Lyonnais Gang's main rivals was the Corsican Mafia, a powerful and deeply rooted criminal organization with extensive networks across France and the Mediterranean. The Corsicans were known for their ruthless efficiency, and their own legacy of organized crime stretched back decades. Clashes between these two groups often involved ambushes, assassinations, and retaliatory attacks. Unlike the Lyonnais Gang's precision-driven robberies, the Corsican Mafia's violence was often more chaotic and indiscriminate, heightening tensions and drawing the attention of national law enforcement. The battles were not limited to large-scale shootouts, but also involved psychological warfare. Both sides used intimidation, threats to family members, and strategic sabotage to destabilize the other's operations. In some cases, smaller gangs aligned themselves with either the Lyonnais Gang or their rivals, creating complex networks of alliances and betrayals. These shifting allegiances kept the criminal underworld in a state of constant flux, where yesterday's enemy could become today's reluctant ally. Within Lyon itself, the gang had to contend with local street gangs and smaller factions that resisted their expansion. While the Lyonnais Gang operated with military precision and discipline, many local groups relied on numbers and brute force, leading to violent clashes on city streets, in bars, and even in public squares. These confrontations often caused collateral damage, alarming residents and forcing law enforcement to increase their presence, though often still one step behind the gang's movements. The rivalry extended beyond simple territorial control. The Lyonnais Gang sought to monopolize the heist market, targeting armored trucks and banks that smaller groups could only dream of. This ambition fueled resentment and hostility, as others viewed them as arrogant upstarts who disrupted the traditional balance of power. To maintain their edge, the Lyonnais Gang not only fought these rival groups, but also infiltrated and sabotaged their operations through bribery and intimidation. These violent encounters also served as tests of loyalty and resilience within the gang itself. Members were pushed to their limits, often called upon to defend territory or retaliate against attacks with equal ferocity. The internal discipline and code of silence helped the gang withstand pressure from these conflicts, but the constant threat of violence added another layer of danger to their already perilous lives. The Lyonnais Gang's battles with rival criminal groups were a defining chapter in their history, shaping their identity as not just master robbers but hardened warriors of the underworld. Their ability to survive and often come out on top in these brutal confrontations only cemented their reputation as France's most ruthless and effective criminal organization during the 1970s. Despite their near-mythical ability to evade capture for years, the Lyonnais Gang's reign of terror in the 1970s was not destined to last forever. The combination of increasing pressure from law enforcement agencies, advances in investigative techniques, and internal vulnerabilities eventually led to the gang's downfall. Yet, even after their arrests, the gang left behind a legacy that continues to fascinate criminologists, historians, and true crime enthusiasts to this day. By the mid to late 1970s, the French police, frustrated by repeated failures to apprehend key gang members, began a concentrated and coordinated effort to dismantle the organization. This effort included creating specialized task forces, increasing surveillance operations, and collaborating with international agencies as the gang's reach extended beyond Lyon. The police invested heavily in tracking the gang's movements, studying their patterns, and exploiting any weaknesses in their operations. One critical breakthrough came when investigators managed to infiltrate lower-ranking members who, under intense interrogation and facing lengthy sentences, began to crack the code of silence. Though the gang's strict loyalty code had protected them for years, the mounting pressure and fear of spending decades behind bars caused some to provide crucial information. These betrayals, while rare, were enough to tip the scales. Another factor contributing to the gang's eventual capture was the rapid advancement of forensic science and communication monitoring. Technologies such as wiretapping, improved fingerprint analysis, and electronic surveillance gave law enforcement tools that the gang had underestimated or been unable to fully counter. These techniques enabled the police to catch the gang off guard during meetings, transfers of stolen money, or planned operations. The arrest operations were carefully planned, often involving coordinated raids in multiple locations simultaneously to prevent suspects from warning each other. The gang's core members, including Edmond Vidal, were among those apprehended in dramatic standoffs that marked the end of an era for organized crime in France. Vidal's capture was particularly symbolic, representing the fall of the man who had orchestrated some of the most daring crimes in French history. Yet, even as the Lyonnais Gang was dismantled, their story did not fade into obscurity. Their audacity, discipline, and the sheer scale of their crimes captured the imagination of the public and inspired books, documentaries, and films. In many ways, the gang became a symbol of the turbulent social and economic climate of 1970s France, a time of rapid change, inequality, and the blurring lines between order and chaos. Their legacy also influenced how law enforcement approached organized crime thereafter. The failures and eventual success against the Lyonnais Gang led to reforms in policing, the creation of specialized anti-gang units, and more robust interagency cooperation. The lessons learned from the gang's rise and fall helped shape modern criminal justice strategies in France and beyond. Even today, stories of the Lyonnais Gang circulate in criminal folklore, warning new generations about the dangers of unchecked ambition, loyalty, and the dark allure of the outlaw life. Their name remains synonymous with audacity, brutality, and the complex interplay between power and justice. The story of the Lyonnais Gang is a stark reminder of how ambition, loyalty, and sheer cunning can shape the darkest chapters of a society's history. They operated in the shadows, challenging the law and pushing the limits of what was thought possible in criminal enterprise. But their rise, and inevitable fall, also highlights the resilience of justice and the tireless work of those determined to uphold it. Though the gang's reign ended decades ago, their legacy lives on as a cautionary tale, a testament to the power of organization and strategy when wielded for crime, and a warning of the consequences that await when that power is confronted by the unyielding forces of law and order. In the end, the Lyonnais Gang remains etched in history not only as ruthless robbers, but as complex figures whose story continues to captivate and instruct. Their tale is a chapter in France's past that teaches us about the fragile balance between chaos and control, and the eternal struggle to maintain that balance in any society.